The Ashford estate sat at the end of Willow Creek Road like a photograph slowly fading in a drawer. 3 stories of white stone and arched windows surrounded by gardens that had once been photographed for architectural journals. By the spring of 1962, the hedges had grown wild along the iron fence, and the fountain in the circular driveway no longer ran. The house still looked grand from the road, but up close you could see the paint peeling near the roofline. Claire Ashford had lived there alone for 8 months, ever since her father's funeral. She was 27 years old and owned everything inside those walls. She had never asked for any of it. Her father, Edmund Ashford, had built a perfume empire from a single storefront in New York. By the time he died, his name was on bottles in department stores across the country. He had spent 40 years traveling between factories, meeting with chemists, negotiating contracts with European suppliers. Claire had grown up watching him pack suitcases and leave for weeks at a time. Her mother died when she was 9. After that, it was mostly just Claire and the housekeeper, Mrs. Harding, waiting for Edmund to come home. He would arrive with gifts, silk scarves, music boxes, porcelain dolls, but he rarely stayed more than a few days. Claire learned early that love, in her family, was something you received in packages. When Edmund collapsed in his office on a Tuesday afternoon in August 1961, the lawyers came to the estate within hours. They explained that Claire was now the sole owner of Ashford & Co., along with the house, the investments, and a trust worth more than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. She sat in the library while they spoke, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. She signed where they told her to sign. She asked no questions. The lawyers left and Claire walked upstairs to her father's bedroom. She stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the bed he would never sleep in again. Then she closed the door and never opened it. The company had a board of directors, men in their 50s and 60s who had worked with Edmund for decades. They assured Claire that she didn't need to involve herself in operations. They would handle everything. All she had to do was attend quarterly meetings and approve annual reports. She agreed. She had no interest in perfume, in business, in any of it. She had grown up surrounded by the scent of jasmine and bergamot, and it had always made her feel slightly nauseous. The house still smelled like her father's cologne. She opened windows constantly, but the smell never quite left. For the first few months, people called. Friends of her father, business associates, distant relatives she had met only at weddings and funerals. They offered condolences, asked if she needed anything, invited her to dinners and charity galas. Claire thanked them politely and declined. She stopped answering the phone after a while. Mrs. Harding took messages and left them on the hall table. Claire glanced at them occasionally but rarely called anyone back. The invitations stopped coming. The phone rang less often. By winter, the house was quiet except for the sound of Mrs. Harding moving through the rooms, dusting furniture that no one sat on. Claire spent most of her days in the sunroom at the back of the house. It faced the gardens, and in the mornings, light came through the tall windows and made patterns on the floor. She would sit in a wicker chair with a book in her lap, though she rarely read more than a few pages. Mostly she watched the trees sway in the wind. She had always liked watching things move without having to move herself. Mrs. Harding brought her tea at 10 and lunch at noon. Claire ate small portions and left the rest. She was losing weight, though she didn't notice. Her dresses hung a little looser. Her wrists looked thinner. She didn't look in mirrors much anymore. There was a full-length mirror in her bedroom, the same one her mother had used. Claire passed it every morning on her way downstairs, and every morning she kept her eyes on the floor. Once in late October, she stopped in front of it. She stood there for almost 5 minutes, looking at her reflection. Her hair needed cutting. Her skin looked pale. The dress she wore, navy blue with pearl buttons, had been her mother's. She had found it in a trunk in the attic and had been wearing it for 3 days straight. She looked at herself and felt nothing. Not sadness, not recognition, just a distant curiosity, as if she were looking at a stranger in a department store window. She turned away and never stopped at the mirror again. In November, she found herself standing in the hallway outside her father's study. The door had been closed since the funeral. Mrs. Harding had asked once if she should clean the room, and Claire had said no. Now Claire stood with her hand on the doorknob, feeling the cool metal against her palm. She could smell the room through the crack under the door. Leather, tobacco, that cologne he always wore. She turned the knob slowly. The door opened an inch. She could see the edge of his desk, papers still scattered across it. She stood there for 10 minutes, maybe longer, her hand shaking slightly. Then she pulled the door closed and walked away. Her heart was beating fast, and she didn't know why. December brought the first snow. Claire watched it fall from the sunroom, thick flakes that covered the gardens and made everything look clean. Mrs. Harding asked if she wanted a fire lit in the drawing room. Claire said no. She liked the cold. It made her feel more awake, more present, even though she spent most of her time sitting still. At night, she would lie in bed and listen to the house settle around her. The old pipes groaned, the floorboards creaked. Sometimes she heard mice in the walls. She didn't mind. It was company of a sort. On Christmas Eve, Mrs. Harding brought Claire a small wrapped package. She said it was from her, just something simple. Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a cashmere scarf, dove gray, very soft. Claire ran her fingers over it and felt something catch in her throat. She thanked Mrs. Harding quietly. Mrs. Harding nodded and left the room. Claire sat holding the scarf for a long time. It was the first gift anyone had given her in months, maybe longer. She folded it carefully and placed it on the table beside her chair. She never wore it, but she touched it sometimes when she thought no one was looking. The new year came without ceremony. Claire didn't stay up to watch it arrive. She went to bed at 9, as she always did, and woke the next morning to the same light coming through the same windows. January was gray and cold. The gardens looked skeletal. The fountain was covered with a tarp to protect it from frost, though Claire wasn't sure why anyone bothered. It hadn't worked in years. She thought about having it removed, then realized she didn't care enough to make the call. In the second week of January, a letter arrived from the company. It was addressed to her personally, marked urgent. Mrs. Harding brought it to her on a silver tray. Claire looked at it for a moment, then set it aside unopened. Mrs. Harding hesitated. She asked if Claire wanted her to open it. Claire said no. The letter sat on the side table for 3 days. Every time Claire walked past it, she felt a small tightness in her chest. On the 4th day, she picked it up. She held it in her hands, feeling the weight of the expensive paper. She ran her finger under the seal, breaking it. Then she put the letter down again, still folded, and walked away. She never read it. A week later, Mrs. Harding quietly removed it and placed it with the other unopened mail in the desk in the front hall. There were dozens of letters there now, some from the company, some from lawyers, some from people Claire didn't know. They were all waiting for her attention, waiting for decisions she couldn't bring herself to make. The desk drawer was almost full. In March, one of the board members, a man named Gerald Whitmore, came to the estate unannounced. He said he wanted to discuss some financial matters. Claire met him in the drawing room, sitting across from him in a high-backed chair. Gerald was polite, almost apologetic. He explained that the company was doing well, that sales had increased, that a new line of products was launching in the fall. He asked if she had given any thought to her role in the business. Claire looked at him without expression. She said she hadn't. Gerald shifted in his seat. He suggested that she might want to attend a board meeting, meet the new marketing director, perhaps visit the flagship store in Manhattan. Claire listened to him talk. She watched his mouth move, forming words that seemed to come from very far away. She noticed he wore a gold wedding band, that his tie was slightly crooked, that he kept glancing at his watch. He was nervous. She realized, with a kind of detached clarity, that he was afraid of her. Not of her as a person, but of what she represented. Uncertainty, instability, a fortune without a guiding hand. He needed her to care. He needed her to take charge, or at least to give him permission to keep taking charge. She felt nothing for him, neither sympathy nor irritation, just a vast, echoing emptiness. She told him she would think about it. Gerald stood, relieved to be dismissed. He shook her hand. His palm was damp, and left quickly. Claire watched his car disappear down the driveway. She sat in the drawing room for another hour, not moving, listening to the clock on the mantel tick. When Mrs. Harding came to ask about dinner, she found Claire still sitting there, staring at nothing. Mrs. Harding didn't ask if she was all right. She had stopped asking that months ago. April arrived with rain that lasted for days. The gardens turned to mud. Water pooled in the driveway and the gutters overflowed. Claire listened to it drum against the windows. She found the sound soothing. It reminded her of being young, of staying home from school sick, lying in bed while rain fell outside. Her mother had been alive then. She had brought Claire soup and sat on the edge of the bed, reading aloud from picture books. Claire tried to remember her mother's voice but couldn't. She could remember the words, the stories, but the sound of the voice was gone. One rainy afternoon, Claire went up to the attic. She hadn't been there since she'd found the box of photographs in June. The space smelled like old wood and dust. Light came through a small round window at one end. She walked slowly between stacks of furniture covered in sheets, old trunks, boxes of things no one had looked at in decades. She found a smaller trunk pushed into a corner. It was locked, but the lock was rusted through. She pulled on it and it broke apart in her hand. Inside were her mother's things: dresses wrapped in tissue paper, shoes, a hat box filled with letters. Claire lifted out a pale green dress, silk, with tiny buttons down the back. It still smelled faintly of perfume, something floral that Claire didn't recognize. She held it up to the light. It was beautiful. Her mother had been beautiful. Claire tried to imagine wearing it, going somewhere, being the kind of woman who wore silk dresses. The image wouldn't form. She folded the dress carefully and put it back. At the bottom of the trunk was a leather journal. Claire opened it to the first page. Her mother's handwriting, neat and slanted. The entry was dated 1934. Claire read the first line. "Edmund asked me to marry him today. I said yes, though I'm not certain why." She closed the journal quickly, her hands shaking. She put it back in the trunk and closed the lid. She sat on the attic floor for a long time, her back against a stack of boxes, listening to the rain. When she finally went back downstairs, it was almost dark. Mrs. Harding was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Claire walked past without speaking and went to the sunroom. She sat in her usual chair and looked out at the rain-soaked gardens. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how. By May, Claire had stopped leaving the estate entirely. Mrs. Harding did the shopping, picked up prescriptions, handled anything that required going into town. Claire told herself it was easier this way. She had everything she needed. There was no reason to go anywhere. But the truth, which she didn't say aloud, was that she had begun to feel a strange heaviness when she thought about stepping outside the gates. Not fear, exactly. More like exhaustion. The idea of putting on a coat, getting into the car, driving down familiar streets, it all felt impossibly tiring. She stayed in the sunroom. She watched the seasons change through glass. There was a day in mid-May when she walked to the front door. It was a Wednesday late morning. Mrs. Harding had gone to the market. The house was completely silent. Claire stood in the entryway, looking at the door. It was heavy oak, with a brass handle that needed polishing. She had walked through that door 1,000 times. She put her hand on the handle. It was cool and smooth. She turned it. The latch clicked. The door opened an inch. Warm air came in from outside, carrying the smell of cut grass and honeysuckle. Claire stood there, her hand on the door, feeling the breeze on her face. She could see the driveway, the gates, the road beyond. She could walk out. She could get in the car. She could drive anywhere. Her hand tightened on the handle. Her breath came faster. Then she pulled the door shut, turned the lock, and walked back to the sunroom. She didn't try again. The garden had become overgrown, the rose bushes tangled and wild. Claire liked it better that way. It looked less like something her father had controlled and more like something that had escaped. She thought about hiring a gardener, then decided against it. She liked the silence. She liked that no one came to the house anymore. Mrs. Harding was the only person she saw, and Mrs. Harding had worked for the family for 20 years. She knew when to speak and when to leave Claire alone. Most of the time, she left her alone. June brought heat. The sunroom became uncomfortably warm in the afternoons. Claire moved her chair to the shadiest corner, but it didn't help much. Sweat dampened her dress. Her hair stuck to her neck. Mrs. Harding suggested opening more windows, maybe spending time in one of the cooler rooms. Claire shook her head. She had become attached to this space. The thought of sitting anywhere else made her anxious. So she stayed, sweating quietly, watching the heat shimmer over the gardens. One afternoon in early June, Claire found the box of photographs again. Someone, probably Mrs. Harding, had moved it to the library. It sat on a low shelf, waiting. Claire looked at it for several days before finally pulling it down. She sat on the library floor and went through the contents slowly. There were pictures of her father at factory openings, shaking hands with men in suits. Pictures of her mother, young and smiling, holding Claire as a baby. Pictures of Claire herself at various ages, 8, 12, 16, always dressed carefully, always standing next to her father at some event. She didn't remember most of these moments. She looked at her own face in the photographs and felt like she was looking at a stranger, a girl who had been posed and photographed but never quite seen. There was one photograph that stopped her. She was maybe 14, wearing a white dress, standing in this very garden. Her father was beside her, his hand on her shoulder. They were both looking at the camera, both smiling. But Claire could see something in her own eyes in that photograph, something that made her chest tighten. A pleading, a desperation to be noticed, to matter, to be more than a decorative element in her father's life. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she tore it in half, slowly, deliberately. She tore it again and again until it was just pieces. She gathered the pieces in her hand and let them fall back into the box. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just emptiness. At the bottom of the box, she found the letter her father had written to her mother before they were married. It was dated 1933. He wrote about his plans for the business, his dreams of building something that would last. He mentioned love only once, in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought. Claire read it twice. She tried to imagine her mother reading this letter, deciding to marry a man who cared more about perfume than people. She wondered if her mother had regretted it. She wondered if her mother had felt this same emptiness, this same sense of being slowly erased. She put the letter back in the box. She carried the box downstairs and left it in the hallway. Mrs. Harding asked if she should store it somewhere. Claire said no. She said she didn't want to see it again. Mrs. Harding took it away that same afternoon. The summer passed slowly. Claire stopped keeping track of days. She woke when light filled the sunroom and went to bed when it got dark. She ate less. She spoke less. Her voice, when she used it, sounded strange to her own ears. Hoarse, unfamiliar. Mrs. Harding began to worry, though she said nothing directly. She had seen grief before, but this felt different. This felt like someone slowly erasing themselves. She tried to engage Claire in conversation, asked her opinion on small matters, what to serve for dinner, whether to replace the curtains in the drawing room. Claire answered briefly, politely, without interest. One evening in July, Mrs. Harding found Claire standing in the hallway, looking at a painting on the wall. It was a landscape, nothing remarkable, something Edmund had bought years ago. Claire was staring at it as if she'd never seen it before. Mrs. Harding asked if something was wrong. Claire didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I don't think I've ever really looked at this before." Mrs. Harding didn't know what to say to that. She stood beside Claire looking at the painting. It showed a river, some trees, a cloudy sky. It was ordinary. After a while, Claire walked away. Mrs. Harding stayed there for a moment longer, feeling deeply uneasy. She called the family lawyer the next day, asked if there was someone who should be notified. The lawyer said Claire was an adult, that there was nothing legally concerning. He suggested patience. Mrs. Harding hung up feeling more alone than before. She considered calling a doctor, but what would she say? That Claire was quiet, that she didn't go out, that she seemed to be fading. None of that was a medical emergency, so Mrs. Harding did nothing. She watched, she waited, she worried. In August, a journalist from a women's magazine called The House. She wanted to interview Claire for a piece about heiresses and modern women in business. Mrs. Harding took the call in the kitchen. She said Miss Ashford was unavailable. The journalist asked when would be a better time. Mrs. Harding said she didn't know. The journalist asked if Miss Ashford might be interested in just a brief phone conversation. Mrs. Harding said no. The journalist thanked her and hung up, sounding disappointed. 2 weeks later, a photographer appeared at the gate, hoping to get a picture of the estate. Mrs. Harding sent him away before he could even ring the bell. Claire never knew about either visit. Mrs. Harding had stopped mentioning the outside world. It seemed kinder that way. By August, Claire had moved most of her belongings into the sunroom. She slept on the wicker sofa, wrapped in blankets even though the nights were warm. She ate meals there. She kept a small stack of books on the floor, though she rarely opened them anymore. The rest of the house remained untouched, rooms full of furniture no one used. Mrs. Harding cleaned them out of habit, but it felt increasingly like maintaining a museum. She wondered sometimes if Claire even remembered the other rooms existed. She wondered if Claire remembered that the world beyond the gates still turned. Claire's dreams had changed. She used to dream about her mother, about childhood, about specific memories. Now her dreams were formless. Just sensations, colors, the feeling of moving through empty rooms. Sometimes she dreamed she was looking for something, though she never knew what. She would wake up disoriented, unsure of where she was. It would take several minutes for the sunroom to come into focus, for her to remember that this was her life now. This chair, this room, this silence. One night in late August, she dreamed about the ocean. She had only been to the ocean once when she was very young. Her parents had taken her to Cape Cod for a weekend. She remembered standing on the beach, feeling the sand between her toes, watching waves crash against the shore. In the dream, she was standing in the same place, but she was alone. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions. The water was dark. She walked toward it slowly. The waves came closer. She kept walking. The water reached her ankles, her knees, her waist. She kept walking. She went under. She woke up gasping, her heart pounding. The sunroom was dark. She could hear crickets outside. She lay there for hours, unable to fall back asleep. September arrived cooler, with morning fog that burned off by noon. The light in the sunroom changed, became softer, more golden. Claire sat in her usual chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fog move through the trees. She had started to feel like she was watching everything from very far away, as if there was a sheet of glass between her and the world. She could see it, but she couldn't touch it. She couldn't feel it. She was separate. She had always been separate, but now she could see it clearly. Mrs. Harding noticed the change. Claire had always been quiet, but now she barely spoke at all. Days would pass with nothing more than a nod, a brief thank you when food was brought. Her eyes had a distant quality, as if she were looking through things rather than at them. Mrs. Harding tried to reach her. She would sit in the sunroom sometimes, in the chair across from Claire, and talk about small things, the weather, something she'd seen in town, a recipe she was thinking of trying. Claire would nod occasionally, but rarely responded. Still, Mrs. Harding kept trying. She didn't know what else to do. On a Thursday morning in mid-September, Claire woke before dawn. The sunroom was gray with pre-morning light. She sat up on the sofa, her blanket falling away. She felt different. Not better, not worse, just different. Clear somehow. She stood slowly. Her legs were stiff. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden. Everything was very still. The fog was thick. She could barely see the trees. She pressed her hand against the glass. It was cold. She stayed there for a long time, her hand on the window, her breath fogging the glass. Then she turned and walked out of the sunroom. She moved through the house slowly, as if seeing it for the first time in months. The hallway, the stairs, the landing with its tall windows, her father's study door, still closed, her mother's room, frozen in time. She walked through every room on the second floor, touching nothing, just looking. The house was beautiful. It was also a tomb. She had been living in a tomb. She went downstairs. The front door was ahead of her. She walked to it. She stood there, looking at it. She thought about the last time she'd tried to open it, how her hand had shaken, how she'd felt that crushing weight of exhaustion. She didn't feel that now. She felt nothing. She unlocked the door. She opened it. Cool morning air came in, carrying the smell of wet grass and earth. She stepped outside. Her bare feet touched the stone steps. They were cold. She walked down to the driveway. The gravel hurt her feet. She kept walking. She reached the gate. It was closed but not locked. She pushed it open. It swung wide with a long creak. She stood at the edge of the property, looking at the road. It was empty. The fog was so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. She took one step forward, then another. Then she was on the road walking. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't have a plan. She was wearing a nightgown and nothing else. Her feet were bare. The road was rough. But she kept walking. She walked past the neighbor's property, past the old oak tree that marked the corner, past the place where the road curved and started downhill toward town. The fog surrounded her completely. She couldn't see where she'd come from. She couldn't see where she was going. She was just walking, one foot in front of the other, in a world that had shrunk to just a few feet of gray road ahead. Mrs. Harding arrived at the estate at 8 that morning, as she always did. She let herself in through the kitchen entrance and started preparing breakfast. She brought tea to the sunroom at 9. The room was empty. The blankets were folded neatly on the sofa. Claire's shoes were by the door. Mrs. Harding felt a spike of alarm. She called for Claire. No answer. She walked through the house, checking each room. The upstairs, the library, the drawing room. All empty. She went back downstairs and saw the front door. It was standing open. She ran to it. The gate at the end of the driveway was open too. Mrs. Harding stood on the front steps, calling Claire's name. Her voice disappeared into the fog. She went back inside and called the police at 10. They arrived by 11, 2 officers who looked around the house and took notes. They asked about Claire's state of mind, her habits, whether she had friends or family nearby. Mrs. Harding answered as best she could. She explained that Claire had been withdrawn, quiet, but not actively suicidal, not threatening. The officers asked if anything was missing. Mrs. Harding checked. Claire's purse was in her room, her wallet, her keys. The car was in the garage. Nothing was gone except Claire herself. The officers said they would file a report, check hospitals, make inquiries. They asked for a recent photograph. Mrs. Harding found one from 2 years ago, before Edmund died. Claire looked different in it, younger, more alive. The officers took it and left. Days passed. The police found nothing, no sign of Claire, no indication of where she might have gone. They searched the woods behind the estate. They checked the bus station in town, the train station 2 towns over. Nothing. Her bank accounts were untouched. No unusual activity, no withdrawals. It was as if she had simply walked out of her life and evaporated. The board of directors at Ashford & Co. held an emergency meeting. They discussed legal options, contingency plans, what to do if she never returned. They hired a private investigator. He spent 3 weeks searching and found exactly nothing. The story appeared briefly in the local papers. Perfume heiress missing. But it never gained traction. There was no scandal, no mystery compelling enough to hold public attention. Claire had lived quietly, and she disappeared the same way. Mrs. Harding stayed at the estate for 2 more months, waiting. She kept the house clean, kept the kitchen stocked, kept Claire's room exactly as it had been. She told herself Claire might come back, that she might walk through the door one day, tired and ready to rest. But as September turned to October, and October turned to November, Mrs. Harding began to understand that she was waiting for someone who was already gone. Not dead, necessarily, just gone, erased by choice or circumstance or something in between. In early December, Mrs. Harding gave notice. She couldn't stay anymore. The silence was too heavy. The house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by absence. The lawyers took over managing the property. Mrs. Harding packed her things, took one last walk through the room she'd cleaned for 20 years, and left. She drove past the estate sometimes after that, saw the iron gates closed, the gardens growing wilder. She thought about Claire often. She wondered if Claire had found what she was looking for, or if she had simply stopped looking altogether. The investigation continued in name only. Police checked periodically for any new leads. There were none. Claire Ashford remained a missing person, her case file growing dustier in a cabinet somewhere. The company continued operating under the board's direction. Sales remained steady. The new product line launched successfully. The Ashford name continued to appear on bottles in stores across the country, but the woman who owned that name had vanished completely. Years later, someone would ask Mrs. Harding what she thought had happened. She would pause, considering her words carefully. Then she would say that Claire had inherited a fortune built on making people feel beautiful, but she had never felt seen. She had lived in a house full of expensive things and empty rooms. She had been surrounded by her father's success and her own inheritance, but none of it had ever been hers. Not really. And one day, Mrs. Harding would say, Claire must have realized that disappearing was easier than continuing to exist in a life that had never fit. But that was speculation. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. Claire Ashford had walked out of her house on a September morning, barefoot and wearing only a nightgown, and never came back. She left behind a fortune, a legacy, and a name that still appeared on bottles of perfume in stores across the country. She left behind a house that eventually sold to strangers who knew nothing about the girl who had lived there. She left behind a silence that no one quite knew how to fill. The perfume company thrived for another 30 years before being sold to a larger corporation. The Ashford name faded from labels, replaced by something more modern, more marketable. The estate was demolished in the 1984, turned into a development of modest homes. The gardens were paved over. The fountain was removed and sold to an antique dealer. Nothing remained to suggest that someone had once lived there, watching the world from behind glass, waiting for a reason to step outside. Some stories end with answers. Some end with resolution. This one ends the way it began, with absence. With a woman who inherited everything and wanted none of it. With a life lived so quietly that when it ended, hardly anyone noticed. Claire Ashford is still listed as a missing person, though no one has searched for her in decades. Her name appears occasionally in archives, in old newspapers, in forgotten files. But the woman herself, what she wanted, where she went, whether she ever found peace, remains unknown. Perhaps she's still out there somewhere, living under a different name, in a place where no one knows about perfume or legacies or estates at the end of long driveways. Perhaps she found a small town where she could be no one, where her past didn't follow her, where she could finally breathe without the weight of inheritance pressing down. Perhaps she walked into that fog and just kept walking, through towns and states and years, becoming someone new with every mile. Perhaps she learned to speak again, to laugh, to feel something other than emptiness. Perhaps she found a small apartment above a bakery, got a job serving coffee, made friends who never asked about her past. Perhaps she became, finally, just a person, ordinary, invisible, free. Or perhaps the ending is darker. Perhaps she walked into the woods that morning and never walked out. Perhaps she reached a point where walking stopped making sense, where the weight finally became too much, where the distance between her and the world grew too wide to cross. Perhaps she's still there, somewhere in those woods, returned to the earth, silent and finally at peace. Perhaps she found the only escape that felt complete. We'll never know. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Claire's disappearance wasn't a tragedy or a mystery. Maybe it was just the only choice that ever felt like hers. To vanish, to refuse the script, to step out of a life that had been written for her before she was born, to become, at last, invisible, to choose absence over presence, silence over speech, nothing over everything. The house is gone. The company is gone. The fortune has been dispersed and reinvested and spent by people who never knew Edmund Ashford or his daughter. But somewhere in a file cabinet, in a dusty archive, there's a photograph of a young woman standing in a garden, looking just past the camera, her expression unreadable. She's wearing a pale blue dress. Her hair is pulled back, She looks like she's about to say something. Or maybe like she's already said everything she had to say and is waiting for permission to leave. That photograph is all that remains. A moment captured but never explained. A woman who existed, briefly, in the light, before choosing the darkness of anonymity. And in that choice, in that final act of erasure, perhaps she found something the fortune could never buy. Perhaps she found the one thing that had been denied to her all her life. Perhaps she found herself. Or perhaps she found the mercy of losing herself completely. Either way, she walked into the fog, and the fog swallowed her whole, and she was finally, completely, gone.